Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Board of Directors of Heritage NL, I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's Provincial Historic Commemorations Program ceremony. Heritage NL is a not-for-profit Crown agency of the Provincial Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, and Recreation. Established in 1984, Heritage NL has a mandate to help preserve the rich heritage of Newfoundland and Labrador. We are celebrating 39 years of protecting, promoting, and preserving our province's built heritage. Heritage NL also supports the safeguarding of the province's intangible cultural heritage by working with communities and groups to document, pass on, and celebrate cultural traditions and traditional knowledge. In 2016, Heritage NL took over the Provincial Historic Commemorations Program from the provincial government. This program is guided by a selection committee comprised of myself, Joan Ritzie, and Dr. Olaf Jensen. Much thanks to the committee for its work in reviewing applications and making recommendations to the Heritage NL Board. As always, thanks to those who submit recommendations. This is a public-led initiative, so please check out our website if you would like to submit to the commemorations program. Now, anyone who knows anything about my own research knows that I study aviation history. So tonight's commemoration is certainly one that I am proud of, as we have so much amazing aviation history here in this province. Unfortunately, the Minister of Tourism, Culture, Arts, and Recreation, the Honorable Steve Crocker, could not be here tonight and sends his apologies. We at Heritage NL are grateful for the continued support and funding from the Provincial Historic Commemorations Program and other Heritage NL programs and initiatives. So now I would like to introduce the Chair of the Commemorations Program Committee, Joan Ritzie.
Thank you, Lisa. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in. On behalf of the Provincial Historic Commemorations Program Committee, welcome to this evening's ceremony. This program was started to recognize the aspects of our history and culture which have had a broad impact on our province. Based somewhat on the National Historic Sites and Monuments Board, the program recognizes people, places, and events of provincial significance. But unlike the national program, it also recognizes aspects of our traditional culture and living tradition bearers. Counting this evening's commemoration, the program has now declared 40 designations. You can check out previous designations under the Discover section of Heritage NL's website, www.heritagenl.ca. The commemorations program is citizen-led. Anyone can submit nominations for consideration by the committee. This evening, on National Aviation Day, we are recognizing pilot, engineer, parachutist, innovator, inventor, and search and rescue specialist, John Joseph Joe Gilmore, as an exceptional person from the past. Mr. Gilmore was nominated by Robert Pelly. I'll now turn things over to Robert to explain why he nominated Mr. Gilmore. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure for me to talk to you about Joe Gilmore, but I should point out to you that normally in my everyday speaking, I speak French, so I may throw in a few French words. Don't worry about it; it's not contagious. I started working on the history of Newfoundland, of Gander, about 15 years ago, and I kept seeing this name pop up, Joe. Joe did this, Joe did that. Joe was everywhere. And I said, I'll have to see if I can find his biography and find out about him. He sounds awfully interesting. Couldn't find one. So I started to dig around, and I managed to come up with about 3 or 4 pages, the initial pages of what might be a biography of this guy. Then one evening I got a phone call with a very suspicious voice. Somebody like it might have been an escapee from the Irish Republican Army. He said, "My name is Sean." It's Sean who? It's Sean Gilmore. I just hit the jackpot, 3 sevens in a row, because with Sean's help, I was able to make up an awful lot more pick up a lot more information about Joe than I ever expected to have stuff that people never ever heard about before. And with the basis of that, I was able to make up a much larger document, much more complete document to send into your committee. If we were to look at John Joseph Gilmore, we could probably, to understand him quickly, look at 3 or 4 slices. Darrell Hillier will explain some of those slices a bit later on. But basically, if we look at Joe, we could, before he ever came out to Canada, he was a parachutist before people did that silly stuff. He built his own airplane out of spare parts, and he got picked up as a mechanic with Imperial Airways. Within 3 years, he became what I suppose you could call his chief experimental engineer. And when they had the bad jobs to do, he was the guy called upon. His first job on this side of the pond was, of course, in Botwood. They didn't like the idea of flying across the Atlantic in planes with wheels. Not much good if you land in the water, and you need seaplane bases. And of course, you know who they called upon. It was Joe. Joe did Botwood, so he's not only well known for Gander, but for Botwood as well. He also did the seaplane base in Fort Washington near New York and Boucherville near Montreal. In the meantime, this fellow Hitler started a war, and we started getting aircraft to come in from the United States to fly across to Europe. We had no place to receive them, really, and nobody to check them up before they went on to Gander. And of course, you know who they called upon to do that. It was Joe. He set up an installation in Saint-Hubert and got the aircraft to Gander. You may remember in February of 41, we lost a fellow by the name of Banting, pretty important guy. So they said, look, we better start get Gander working up, not only because of Banting, but they were expecting hundreds, maybe thousands of aircraft that came over. So his installation, he was the guy who was made up the best installation in Ferry Command, and Darrell will tell you about that later on. The other thing I should say about John Joseph Gilmore was that he pretty good in search and rescue, and he did what I would call the 3 Ps: the planes, the pilots, and the people. And Joe, of course, Darrell, of course, will explain a little bit more of that as well. If I were to make a summary of Gilmore, I would say that if you ever had to go to a party and people were all drunk and crazy, you needed somebody to get you home, you need a guy like Gilmore. He got people where they needed to go across the Atlantic. He saved planes, he saved people, and he saved Newfoundlanders. Now, if I ever went to a party and I wanted a guy as a designated driver, I'd pick Joe Gilmore. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Robert. Now I would like to introduce Darrell Hillier. He is a Newfoundland and Labrador aviation researcher. He's usually the one I turn to first if I have questions. He's the author of North Atlantic Crossroads, the Royal Air Force Ferry Command Gander Unit, 1940 to 1946, and the writer of the research paper for this commemoration. Over to you, Darrell.
Well, thank you. Well, first, I'd like to thank the Heritage Foundation Board of Directors and Lisa, of course, Joan Ritzy, and the Commemorations Committee for selecting Joe Gilmore as an exceptional person from the past. And to give credit where it's due, I wish to point out the efforts of Joe Gilmore's nominator, Mr. Pelly, who you just heard from. And Robert has also worked tirelessly to have Joe Gilmore inducted into the Canadian Aviation Hall of Fame. But thankfully, your committee came through to give Gilmore the recognition he deserves. And I was fortunate to connect with Mr. Pelly there quite some years ago. And we exchange emails all the time on Gander's history. And in more recent years, I was fortunate to connect with another marvelous gentleman, and that would be Joe Gilmore's son, Sean, who's with us here this evening. Sean also shared stories with me about his father's career and also a few stories of his own about growing up in wartime Gander as a young boy. So on a personal note, it was the work of Joe Gilmore that inspired me to research and write the history of the RAF Ferry Command Gander unit. And I would say Joe Gilmore's name became known to me probably about 40 years ago, soon after I moved to Gander and took an interest in the town's aviation history. His name cropped up now and again but certainly not often enough, in the few books that were written about Ferry Command. But my first exposure to Joe Gilmore came from the writings of Ferry Command pilot Donald McVicker, who wrote extensively about his experiences ferrying bombers across the North Atlantic through Gander. And Don McVicker always spoke very highly of Joe Gilmore. Of course, crossing the North Atlantic was risky business in the 1940s, not only in wintertime, but certainly year round. But if Joe Gilmore deemed your aircraft airworthy for the long flight overseas, insisted McVicker, you knew you were good to go. Another thing that drew my attention was the level of effort that Gilmore and his men put into salvaging downed aircraft. Of course, American and Canadian forces at Gander did likewise on occasion, but Gilmore's men often went above and beyond. And Joe Gilmore took his work seriously, and he was a professional. His job was to get these aircraft overseas no matter what. And ultimately, under his leadership and tutelage, Gander's ground maintenance section assisted with the overseas delivery of some 4,000 military aircraft during the Second World War. And time and place is everything. And Gander and the Royal Air Force Ferry Command were fortunate to have Joe Gilmore as chief of maintenance. Indeed, the maintenance section came to be comprised mostly of local lads, Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, working shifts 24/7. Some started as apprentices and in time took on more complex jobs. Others went on to become crew chiefs in charge of their maintenance crew. But Gilmore could fly as well, having received his pilot's license in Ireland in 1932. And his aerial expertise was put on display at Gander, rescuing downed airmen or airdropping them supplies, often in his single-engine Fox-Moth biplane. He once even rescued the unit's commanding officer when the bomber on which he was flying force landed in the snowy wilds of southern Newfoundland. In an unusual twist, the commander's teenage son was also aboard, as was the pilot's wife. Gilmore rescued them too, on Christmas Day, no less. Naturally, the next task was to salvage the aircraft, and for this, Joe Gilmore had skis attached to the undercarriage, and the aircraft was flown back to Gander. And I can imagine that to see skis attached to a bomber must have been an unusual sight, and certainly a rarity. But of course, Joe Gilmore didn't stop there. The Newfoundland government often called upon Ferry Command to evacuate seriously ill patients from rural communities accessible only by boat or plane. There was no obligation to do so, but Joe Gilmore always obliged, often at great risk to himself. In such circumstances, expediency was key, and Gilmore was soon winging his way to some nearby coastal community and delivering his patient to hospital at Gander. In some cases, he might even deliver a nurse or a doctor to the patient's doorstep. Gilmore had a deep love and appreciation for Newfoundland and Newfoundlanders, and during such mercy flights, invariably took a Newfoundland member of his maintenance staff with him as aircraft engineer. Joe Gilmore died in 1945, but his influence extended beyond the war years. And this is a point I can't stress enough. With the post-war boom in commercial transatlantic air travel, Gander quickly evolved as the famous crossroads of the world. And many of these local men, Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, who honed their skills under Joe Gilmore, continued careers in aviation at Gander with commercial carriers such as KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, Pan American, Trans World Airlines, Trans Canada Airlines, and so on. Well, I'll clue up with a few words of praise from those who actually worked with or under Joe Gilmore at Gander. John Murphy of St. John's, not the former Mayor John Murphy, but John Murphy of St. John's was confidential secretary to the Ferry Command Gander unit's commanding officer. And he described Joe Gilmore as a surrogate father to us young guys away from home. James Reed, a native of Cowboy, Newfoundland, was a teenager when he first went to work under Joe Gilmore, and he praised his boss as competent, fair, and highly respected. Indeed, one news article published late in the war told how ferry pilots flying back and forth the North Atlantic claimed that Gilmore was the greatest aircraft mechanic in the world today. And for the Newfoundlanders who trained under Gilmore, eulogized the local papers at the time of his death, his loss was almost like that of a beloved parent. So I'll end there, and again, extend my thanks to the Commemorations Committee for recognizing John Joseph Joe Gilmore. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Daryl. So last, I would like to introduce Sean Gilmore, Joe Gilmore's son. And looking through the attendees, we have an awful lot of the Gilmore family here. So welcome to all of you, but I would like to pass this over to Sean.
Thank you so much. To begin, we have an awful lot of people to thank. We've got people to thank in Ireland. We've got people to thank in Newfoundland. We've got the committee to thank. We have Daryl to thank. And above all, I hate to say that, but Robert. Robert's been a bit of a prince for us. We have so many people to thank for supplying the words to the pictures that we have. We have umpteen dozen pictures, but because of our age and where we lived, we weren't allowed to take pictures privately. Any picture that was taken had to be censored. We weren't told anything, and that's not surprising. This was a military base. There were signs all over the place, loose lips, sink ships, the walls have ears, the enemy is listening. So it kind of scared you, but it conditioned you not to ask questions and never to expect answers. But thankfully for us, Daryl, Robert, and Art McGuinness in Ireland, Patrick Devlin in Ireland, have supplied the words to many of those pictures. Not all of them. Some of them will stay a mystery, I think, for a very, very long time. I was saying before that this is the fourth time our father has been honored. That's our count. The first one, and I think probably for his career and for us, was our mother agreeing to marry him. And it's not that he didn't have choices. I remember I went to Ireland and I was brought with by a cousin to see an aunt who was in a nursing home. Well, she summoned me to the foot of her bed. And I say summoned because that's the way women are in our family. They're strong. And I stood at the foot of her bed. She looked me over, and boy, did she look me over. And then she announced, and it was an announcement. Well, I'll tell you this, you're not as good looking as your father. Then as I was leaving, there was this gorgeous old lady, and I said gorgeous, she must have been beautiful when she was young. She said with this lovely wistful voice, Josie Gilmore, many of the girls' hearts he broke when he married your mother. So I knew then that we were gifted with a marvelous mother and a great father. Our father, everyone says he was a surrogate parent to them. He was our parent. He was a man you were comfortable to be with. He was a pleasure to be around. He was no sharp edges kind of guy. Even as children, we knew he loved us. He didn't have to tell us that, but he did. And he did often, collectively and privately or individually. And he had a kind of a game. He would ask us, how much do you love me? And we would have to give a number. So we'd give a number and he'd give us a bigger number. And he always added, and a little dicky bird. So as my sister Josie would tell you, she understood about billions and trillions by the time she was 3 years old. I don't think she ever wrapped her head around the wee dicky bird. He was a gentleman. He was soft. I've said no sharp edges, and I mean that. And in my particular case, I found him to be a listener. I always thought I was a bit of an engineer myself. And I would talk to him about ideas I had, and he listened. He never laughed. He never turned me off. He never turned me down. And that was consistent through the family, but that is my personal experience with him. He died, and it's really unfortunate because the story of Newfoundland was to continue in our family. His goal was to, at the end of the war, and everybody knew by the May the 1st of 45, that the war was about to end. We all knew it. We all knew it. He knew it. The world knew it. He died, what, on the 1st of May? The war ended on the 7th of May. I may be wrong. It might have been the 8th. But the important thing is that this story of Joe Gilmore and Newfoundland, it was planned to continue. Our future as a family was to be in Newfoundland. His death, tragically, for him and for the family, it ended. Our mother, pregnant at the time, was forced again to travel alone. We flew from Gander to Montreal via a B-24. And anyone who's flown in a B-24 knows it is bitter cold, and I mean bitter cold. The bomb bays don't close quite completely. You have walkways between the bomb bays, and air just circulates freely through that ship. But she did it. She did that as she did early in her married life and our family life. She crossed the Atlantic alone. We always have mixed feelings, I have to tell you, about when our fathers are honored. We have the mixed feeling. As a family, we think, you know, there were two of them, and one of them would not have been as successful as he was without the other. Personally, I've done the math. I was born 9 months, almost to the day of his first parachute jump. Now, think about that. That's kind of Lysisteria in reverse. It was obvious she supported him. It was obvious that she loved what he did, encouraged him to do what he did. He loved what he did, and he did it extremely well. I've been fortunate enough to share that life with him. Our family was fortunate enough to share that life with him again. They say you can't choose your parents, but by Lord, if we had a choice, we sure would have done it. No question about that. I thank you all. I thank the people in the blue plaque committees. I thank Heritage NL and the committee members. And I thank Daryl, and I thank Robert. You've put words to the pictures that we were unable to do. There are a couple of stories, like a letter he got from the Air Ministry in Germany. They wanted him, as memory serves, we've lost that letter, unfortunately, but if memory serves, he was asked to come to Germany to teach young glider pilots. If you remember, the Treaty of Versailles prohibited them from building an airfield, an air force, but they did. They did that in the early 30s. But I think our dad exercised excellent judgment. He stayed with Imperial Airways. His judgment was great. I mean, he married our mother, and he chose the winning side in 2 wars, if you like. He fought with the IRA to gain Irish independence. When in 21, following the establishment of the Free State, he joined the Free State Air Force. And it was there in Baldonnel that he built his aircraft. It was in Dublin. Just to give you an idea of the way we traveled around. My brother Pat, who would have loved to be here, I would have loved for him to be here. Our brother Pat was born in Glasgow. I was born in Dublin. My 2 sisters, Margot and Josie, were born in Downpatrick. My sister, Carol, was born in Gander. Our sister, Mary, was born in Montreal. That'll just give you an idea of the way we traveled around, our father traveled around. Incidentally, we lived in Butcherville for a very short while. While we were in Butcherville, it was peacetime, and so we shared in a lot of his activities. We knew what he was doing. We were able to visit the aircraft. We were able to get on board those beautiful Empire flying boats. We saw the Mercury. There's a little story there as well. Josie, my father wanted to call her Mercury. I think my mother won the argument and they named it after our dad. But while we were in Butcherville, we were told to get ready. We were going to go to Greece. There was going to be another base set up in Greece. He was to head it up and we were to follow him there. The war put an end to that. Thank God the war started before we got to Greece. But that's the kind of life we lived. That's the kind of life he lived and loved. We would have settled down in Newfoundland. The story of Joe Gilmore would have continued. There would have been an air service set up with the Norseman, and you can guarantee that it would have been serviced by his Newfoundland crew. Thank you very much again. I appreciate the offer and the opportunity to speak with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean, for that. That was wonderful to hear those stories. And while we're not officially commemorating Mary, we all know that there's a lot of women who certainly help some of the men who get commemorated in these programs. So while this is a commemoration for Joe, we can certainly appreciate that the contributions of Mary Gilmore as well. Again, thank you everyone for attending tonight. Thank you, Joan, as chair of the commemorations program. Thank you, Daryl, for writing up the paper that is up on our website, complete with pictures. Thank you, Robert, for the nomination, and very much thank you, Sean, for attending. And to everyone who attended, whether here on Zoom or on Facebook, this will also be available online for you to view and share. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.